Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Joy Glower. I'm a client development manager with SAIT's corporate training office, and we are here today for the Agile Teams webinar. With that, thanks for joining us today, Joey. Hand it over to you.
Thank you all. I hope everyone can hear and see me okay. It is absolutely a privilege to be here on this rainy day in Calgary presenting to you on a wonderful topic, at least a topic I get impassioned on, and that's Agile. One of the things that we've started to do, at least in my workplace, is something called a presentation or a meeting promise. And so I thought that I'd bring that forward to you folks. And so in about 45 minutes, give or take, depending on some of the questions, I promise I want to be able to facilitate an interactive session with you folks and hopefully develop a shared understanding of how we define Agile. It is a buzzword out there with many definitions, why it's gaining popularity, where it applies, and how it typically works in practice. And if we can do that, then I think it's a good 45 minutes spent. When you hear the word Agile, and what's the first reaction on the positive? So when you first hear the word Agile, what's a reaction or an impression that comes to mind for you? Is it something that resonates with you? How? What are some of the thoughts there? So we have words like responsive, we have flexible, we have efficient. So I'll pick on a couple of these words just I don't want to say at random because they're my selections. A couple of the words that really resonate well with me, and resilience and perseverance. I'll treat those synonymously. Anyone who's spent any bit of time in the project management space, and you can't let the just for men fool you. I've been doing this for quite some time. So anyone who's been doing this for a chunk of time, you know that project management is incredibly difficult. And so for me, I'm just going to try to share with you guys the screen here. I'm going to share the word cloud. Anyone who's spent any time in project management knows how difficult it is. As much as we create these massive, great plans, project plans that will lead us to project nirvana and success, something happens, and inevitably something goes sideways. Requirements were missed. A go live didn't quite happen the way you wanted to. A key resource left. Project was canceled. Something always tends to go in a different direction than intended. And so what we found, at least from my own personal experiences and some of the experiences at Suncor, is that the Agile teams start to actually, because you compartmentalize and you go after these work outcomes and these fantastic successes in short sprints, and you rely upon a team that's building a team-based accountability, what you find is that you're actually able to be a lot more resilient to setbacks. So as you try something in that experimental try and inspect and adapt approach, you try something that doesn't go well, you have a quick ability to pivot. And that becomes almost infectious and almost becomes a contagion, is that the team now does experimentation just as a way of operating. They don't even realize that they're failing in quotations. They're actually just learning and improving. And so from a resilience and perseverance standpoint, definitely comes forward. That flexibility and the adaptive, probably one of the hallmarks of what Agile really is known for, because we actually do everything in small increments and we rely upon the feedback from our customers to be able to guide us in the right direction. It's not often that we get off the path that we're supposed to be on. If we start to go down the wrong path, that inspect and adapt approach, our ability to go after the customer and say, does this look good? It quickly puts us back onto that straight and narrow. So what we find is that our ability to actually be flexible to market conditions, be flexible to the business changing their wants and needs, it allows us to actually really get into that world really quickly. So from that standpoint, it's worked really well. So how about the opposite now? So I advanced the screen, so I hope you guys now see instead of the hashtag success, it's now the opposite. The hashtags sometimes fail. So when you think of Agile, what are some of the negative things that come forward? Scary, complex, uncertainty, costs, oh, excellent. Owners, oh, okay. Unknown, fantastic. Distracted, look at that. This is great. I'll say that in my journey, so I've been leading the Agile Center of Excellence for a couple of years now, and in a past life, way back at ATB, we led the Agile work for a development practice for a few years. At some of the other stops along the way, we've been doing this for a chunk of time. So a lot of these words that are coming forward, certainly they do resonate. They come forward. It's a lot of the urban legends that come out there. So I'll pick on some of these in no particular order. And so the first one, right center in the screen that I'm hoping you guys can see, is the word uncertainty. And boy, it's almost a paradox. On one hand, in the Agile community, we thrive on uncertainty. We love it. We actually solve complex and difficult problems because we can take on uncertainty so well. What I found funny, what's paradoxical about it though, is that we have to actually be able to look at our sponsors, we have to be able to look at the people that might be paying our bills and say, we're going to be going after your business outcome. And they'll want to know, it's the classic project management triangle, they want to know the scope, schedule, cost. And for anyone who's done the Agile projects, typically we're pretty good about cost. We know how many people we'll have on the project. We know for how long that project's going to last. We know the duration, so we can kind of get that schedule aspect nailed down. But what we can't always commit to is what will we be able to produce with this wonderful team that we've assembled, this time that we're going to give them. What can we produce? And so there's an unknown uncertainty. It's almost a leap of faith. And almost without exception, for all the stops I've had in my career, is that every time we go in and we cross that chasm of taking that leap of faith, I've yet to see customers not actually be happy with the outcome in terms of being able to actually go through that exploratory work. But for them to actually cross that chasm and say, I'm going to trust my product owner, I'm going to trust my team to deliver the outcome in the best way that they know, that takes a huge, huge leap of faith. And once they cross it, it's really good. But it's getting to that point. Now, I know some of you out there might be going, yeah, but not all Agile projects are successful. And you're right. But what we've found, though, at least in, again, my own personal experiences in the industry, is that I'd rather, if something's not going to work, I'd rather discover that as early as possible with the least amount of commitment of resources, either money or people. So if I know that a project's not going to succeed, I'd rather learn about that as soon as I can in that project life cycle. So for us, being able to even take on that uncertainty and find out whether this is feasible or not, there's some power into itself. So just pick on another word here that just starts to come forward with there is, in some case, experimental. And I'm not sure why that's a negative reaction here, but maybe I'll try to expand on this from my lens. Is I know that when we go into some of the enterprises, and most of the companies in Calgary, at least from my knowledge, they're all dabbling and they're on their own Agile journey, but they're all trying the Agile journey. And so what they're starting to get down is that, can they try this Agile approach? And is it working? And can they understand what it's going to take to actually instill Agile in the enterprise? So from that standpoint, it becomes an experiment. And a lot of times in the organizations, the experiments are usually looked upon. You'll have the people that would be the resistors that don't want to go through the change, the people that will actually be cheerleaders for your failure. So from that experimental standpoint, Agile's been around for 30 plus years, depending on where your anchor point is. It's been around for a very long time. Yet some folks still think it to be a fad. Some people still think it to be something that isn't tried and true. So from them, they look upon it as, is it something really for us? And I think as you see, as we go forward, hopefully today and beyond, that we can actually address that. Let's talk about Agile. So it is one of the most heavily used terms that I've seen in it seems like the industries go through these little fads of language and nomenclature. And Agile has certainly been, I'll say, top of mind for a lot of companies for quite some time, for the last few years that I can recall. In fact, I think if you were to grab an industry periodical, so whether it's Forbes, MIT Sloan, if you're looking at Gartner, if you're looking at Harvard Business Review, it's tough to pick up one of those articles and not have some kind of reference point back to Agile, scaled Agile, Agile ways of working. But what is Agile? And so while you guys are reading this on the screen, I'll try to break this down into some really simple concepts. To me, at least from my definitions, Agile really isn't a methodology. A lot of folks out there will say it is, and I would challenge that. Really, for me, it's a mindset that is governed or set by a collection of values and principles. And really what it is, it's all about taking a small team, if you can imagine, and take a very small team. I'm going to focus them on some kind of problem, some kind of, preferably a complex and uncertain problem. And then that team now is going to ruthlessly go after and deconstruct and decompose that problem into smaller and smaller chunks. And as they take those chunks, they're going to prioritize them based upon what they think to be the riskiest or the most value producing. And as they take those value producing chunks, they're going to work on it. They're going to finish that chunk, and they're then going to show it to someone. They're going to show it to preferably a customer or someone that can provide some meaningful feedback. And they're going to take that feedback and they're going to try to get either a confirmation that the direction that they're going is good, or they're going to get an affirmation that maybe they have to do a course correction. So for me, Agile is all about taking a team, focusing it ruthlessly on a problem, breaking that problem down to smaller and smaller batches, delivering those batches to a customer where we can get empirical feedback all the way along. And then the last piece there, that very last sentence, and something that unfortunately I've seen some Agile teams kind of lose sight of, the Agile teams always, always, always want to get better. They want to keep improving the product that they're producing, but as a team, as a unit, as a singular unit, they're also striving to get better and to improve. And if you're doing that collection of values and principles, incrementally delivering value in small chunks, getting that feedback and responding to it with the interest of improving, to me, you're actually exhibiting the ability of being agile. So for me, that's my definition. Now, quite some time ago in 2001, there was a group of developers that got together and they created something called the Agile Manifesto. And the Agile Manifesto, it sounds a lot more ominous or foreboding than it really is. What they really came up with was a set of values. They came up with 4 values and 12 principles. And what you see on the screen in front of you right now are the value statements arrived at by those individuals. And this is the reason why I'm calling this out is a lot of times you get those urban legends out there. You get these misnomers about what is Agile, what it isn't, what it does, or what it doesn't do. As an example, something that always burns me, people will say, well, in Agile, you don't do documentation. Well, that's not true. In Agile, you actually don't do a plan. Well, you know what? That's not true either. And in the Agile community, we certainly use processes and we certainly use tools. But when you look in that screen, you look at what's on that middle row, if you will, of the contract negotiation. So when you start to think about, say, working in a large enterprise, and I deal with a line manager to secure a resource, whether it's an engineer or a developer, even if I'm going through and having that conversation over an email, that's still a contract negotiation. There's usually some kind of offer and acceptance to that. We're not saying that contract negotiations don't take place in the Agile community. Instead, what we're actually saying is that we have a preference for collaboration over contract negotiation. We're certainly not saying that you don't want documentation to be produced in the Agile world. However, in terms of knowing whether you're progressing and you're actually hitting the mark and your customer is happy, I'd rather look at the working solution or a consumable solution over comprehensive documentation. Generally speaking, in my time, when I look at some of the customers, they're not too worried about the requirement specification at the end of the day. They're not worried about the KT documentation that you handed to your sustainment teams. They want to know, did what you produce actually work? And is it producing value to their customers? So they're looking for the working output. So from my standpoint, I always like to kind of ground on it that there's a preference. It doesn't mean that's that exclusion to the opposite piece. In that third one from the left there, the adaptability and uncertainty, as you'll discover a little bit later in this presentation, Agile works really well in times of change. It doesn't mean that we don't commit to a direction of trying to understand when we're going to release value, or we don't understand when the project might be finished. But it sure means that we're going to take the responsiveness to the changes that we discover and we'll adapt our plans accordingly. So for me, I always like to ground back to the teams I work with and to myself specifically about these values and principles. So hopefully that helps to land and provide some perspective to you folks about what Agile values look like. So we have a culture, we have a mindset. So, but where does actually Agile apply? That's a great question. I don't want you to read all this. This is taken from Gartner. The reference point is at the back, or is at the bottom of the screen there. And we will be distributing these slides later on, so you can read this to exhaustion later on. But Agile really loves uncertainty. Uncertainty is where where the Agile community seems to be the most successful, at least from my observations. But how do we define uncertainty? So I'm going to jump to the next slide on this one. Well, uncertainty exists in today's complicated and complex environments. And there's actually a model out there to help you understand what does complicated and complex actually mean. So when we look at things, and this is a 4-stage model, there's a concept out there called simple. And so this is basically where I can understand the cause and effect relationship. If I do something, do I understand the effect of my activity or my outcome? And so for me, in that simple world, you have low technical uncertainty, low requirement uncertainty. You're confident that what you can get written down is accurate and won't change very much. The cause and effect relationship is pretty much well established. Advancing down this model, you go from simple to something called complicated. Well, complicated is now where we start to introduce some uncertainty. It can be technical or it can be requirement uncertainty. But we know that with enough time and with enough subject matter expertise, that's what SME stands for, with enough time and subject matter expertise, we can understand the cause and effect relationships. For some of the big accounting deployments, system deployments that we've seen, actually they're complicated, they're not complex. With time, we can understand the implications of cause and effect. It just takes a bit of effort, and we have to have the right experts beside us. If we advance this, we get to something called complex. And that is now where we introduce a lot more technical and requirement uncertainty. And so what we've been able to establish in the complex environments is that you can't possibly understand what the cause and effect relationship is. The only way you can't forecast that. The only way of understanding the cause and effect relationship is to actually try it. So we have to do something. We have to showcase it to our end users, or we have to be able to model it in the form of an experiment, and then we can take an adaptation off of that. And then the final stage is something called chaos, where there's tremendous amounts of uncertainty, both from a requirement standpoint and a technical standpoint. Well, if you look at it, that in our world today, most of the innovation, most of the artificial intelligence, the application building, big data, research and development, digital transformations, those are usually in the realm of complicated and complex. And so for us, this is where Agile starts to work. When I do a lot of the in-class instruction, I hold up this model, and this is something taken from the Agile Practice Guide in the form of the Stacy Complexity Model or the Kinevin Model. When I teach, I actually go through this in an activity or an exercise, and it goes something like this. You can imagine in a classroom, just to represent what simple, complicated, and complex looks like. If I was to take a classroom of 30 people, and I was to say, I want you guys to arrange yourselves from tallest to shortest. Everyone would stand up and they go line up against the wall. Person would look left, they'd look right, and they'd know, okay, this person's taller, I move left, I'm shorter, I'm gonna move right. In about 10, 15 minutes, these people will have aligned themselves up really quickly from tallest to shortest. And they did so without having to speak. They can just do it all in terms of cause and effect. They can look left and right and understand whether they're taller or shorter. If I was to take that and make it a little bit more challenging now, if I was to say, arrange yourselves from tallest to shortest, or excuse me, arrange yourselves from the oldest to youngest using your birth dates. Well, all of a sudden now I've introduced a little bit more uncertainty. They can't just look left and right and then understand the age. Instead, what they have to do is they have to be able to go have a conversation with some person. And they have to say, well, when were you born? Okay, I'm older, I'm younger. So it's not a difficult activity, but the cause and effect is uncertain until you do a little bit of analysis, and that subject matter expertise is that you find out the other person's age. And this other one, going into complex, this is the exact activity that we do. You can imagine that I would say to the audience of 10, 15, 20 people, I've done this with executives as well as just students, and said, I want you to, without saying a word, pick 2 other people in the classroom. And I want you to create an equilateral triangle with those other 2 people, but you can't speak. And so now what happens is a person takes a step and another person takes a step, and you have this entire class moving, and it's impossible to see what's going to happen until you actually take that step. And while some of you might be thinking, there's no way this could possibly actually work in the classroom environment, in about that 10, 15-minute mark, the class will have arranged itself into equilateral triangles with the 3 people. and they would have done so without speaking, but all based upon taking a step, seeing what happens, taking a step and seeing what happens. So in that, you have a representation of simple, where you from tallest to shortest, complicated, using age, and then the third one, complex, at equilateral triangle. I get asked what would chaos look like. Never done this, but what we often say is, could you actually release a tagger inside that room, and what would happen then? Well, you have no idea what the tagger is going to do. You have no idea what the people are going to do. To me, that's the ultimate definition of what chaos might look like. And no, we didn't do that. So that's, for me, that's where Agile makes a lot of sense. So now imagine that in the workplace. I want to share with you some other representations about why Agile is so popular in the enterprises in industry. So just for the sake of a few minutes, let's walk through a couple of examples. When you think of automation, and you think of drones and robotics, and you think back to that Cynefin model, can we possibly understand all the uses of drones until we actually had drones available to us? And it's neat to see what the drone community has now been able to produce. Everything from that, we can get insurance quotes on a car accident based upon drone technology. Drones are being used by police forces, so that when there's a break and enter, a lot of times the criminals will go vertical. So they'll go up into a roof, or they'll go up into a higher elevation. Well, they're using drones now to start to not only track the individuals from a vertical standpoint, but also to watch them progress. So we're being able to take advantage of technologies that we would have never had previously. Think back in I'm going to say 5-10 years ago. We have now new business models that never even existed as recently as 5 years ago. Can you imagine going to your grandparents and trying to explain to them that, hey, grandma, grandpa, imagine that when you go to your vacation home in Arizona for a couple of weeks here, how about we rent out your place for 2 weeks to other vacationers? And when you go to Arizona, don't book a hotel. Go find someone else who's not available in their house and go stay with them. Just think of the reaction that your grandparents would have had to the concept of Airbnb. Or to, hey, you have a couple hours to kill. How about you drive around and you take strangers into your car and you drop them off and they'll pay you a fee. Just think of that concept of Uber. Increasingly, we see time is now the commodity with which we are competing. So we have to get something to the markets faster. We have to be able to pivot when we make a mistake. For the first time in modern history, we now have 4 generations in the workforce. So we have baby boomers, we have the Gen X, we have millennials, and the very first of Gen Z and Gen Zs are now in the workplace. They all have different work styles. If I was to take a team that was comprised of those 4 generations, I don't know how that team is actually going to want to work together. The only way of actually understanding what their team norms will be is for the team to get together and start to go through that forming, storming. So with these 4 generations are even changing how we work. And imagine this, 5 years ago, think of all the jobs that didn't exist. Think of all the roles that didn't exist. And then fast forward to that in 5 years hence, think of all the jobs that didn't exist today that will in the future. So on the screen in front of you, you see Mr. Stampy Cat. Just out of curiosity, through the raise of hands, I'm curious how many of you recognize Mr. Stampy Cat. Any of you guys through a raise of hands there recognize Mr. Stampy Cat? Got 1 or 2. Awesome. You can tell people that have kids. So I have a daughter, and she likes to play Minecraft. And so it wasn't long before I started to hear this voice. And I can't say I'm a fan of this gentleman's voice, but this person would be actually on the TV or on the YouTube showing my daughter how to play Minecraft. Mr. Stampy Cat is actually a gentleman by the name of Mr. Joseph Garrett. And he is a British individual, so he's from Britain. And he used to video on YouTube himself playing Minecraft. And he would just literally annotate and describe his own playing of Minecraft. He'd create his own little worlds and people would start to participate in it. Well, this influencer now, a whole new role that didn't exist until recently, this influencer known as Mr. Joseph Garrett, he actually has over 9 million subscribers on YouTube. So 9 million people are watching him play a video game. He has over 7 billion views of him playing these video games. And what's hard for even me, as hopefully a more of a progressive type person in the Agile community, he is making over $4,000 a day doing just that. So by playing a video game, describing it to his audience, he's making over $4,000 a day. His estimated net worth today is over $15 million because of his influences on Minecraft. And that doesn't include some of the sponsorship deals that he now has available to him. So Mr. Stampy, as an influencer, 5 or 10 years ago, that role didn't exist. Now, all of a sudden, he is doing very well by doing that whole Minecraft gig. Amazing. So what else do we have here? Data. Think of all the data that is now changing in our community. So what some people may not, again, this is going to be distributed to you folks afterwards, but I will highlight a couple things for you. Right now, on a daily basis, we produce over 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. Every day, or excuse me, every year, we produce 90% of the data in a yearly basis is now produced in 1 year for that, all of mankind is produced. So for all the data that is available to all of mankind, 90% of it was produced in the last year. And guess what? In the coming year, 90% is going to be produced again. It's staggering when we start to think of how much information we're actually starting to produce in here. So a couple of things I'll highlight to you, and highlighting them through the stars. So every day, we have over 4 terabytes of data produced by the connected cars. So through OnStar, through the Teslas, 4 terabytes of data. Every day, we have 294 billion emails are being sent. Sometimes I feel like they're all hitting my inbox, but 294 billion emails are being sent every day. For all of you who wear the Apple Watches or the Fitbits, we have 28 petabytes of information being produced. So when you start to think about this, we have all this information now starting to be produced in en masse. What do we do with this information? Who could have predicted that even as recently as 2 years ago, that the Apple Watch could start to have an ability to forecast if a person's about to have a cardiac arrest? So there's been an example. Now they're very careful to say that they don't predict heart attacks and strokes, but there's also been an equal number of people have checked themselves into the hospital and foregone a heart attack because of what's come forward in their Apple Watch. So all this information now is starting to come forward. So point being from these last 2 slides, when you think of the definitions of complicated and complex, we're taking on an incredible amount of information. We're taking on a whole bunch of uncertainty. And so how do we solve some of these opportunities and problems that now are being put in front of us? How does that help? Well, a couple of ways. So what you see on here is that we actually have a disciplined process to which we take on Agile-based work. And so for some of you that have gone through any kind of Scrum training, or some of you that have gone through the disciplined Agile worlds, this screen would look very common, very familiar with to you. So I'll walk you through it really quick. And this is now, when you heard me with that definition of Agile, we're going to take a complex problem, we're going to break it into small increments, we're going to work on those small increments, we're going to produce something of value, we're going to showcase it to our end users or customers, we can get that feedback, and then we're going to adapt or pivot and continually get better. So this, what you're seeing in the screen in front of you, this is how we do that. So you can imagine, just working from left to right here, is that we have a massive backlog. So we might have a list of all the things that our product owner or our customer has asked for. We've gone through and we've carefully sat with them and we said, okay, what do you like most? What do you like least? What's riskiest? What's least risky? And we've ordered or we prioritized our backlog according to that either value or risk represented. And then we have the team. So I'm looking at sprint event number 1 here, sprint planning. We have the team now starting to say, well, for the coming sprint, and for the sake of argument, we'll say that the sprint's 2 weeks. For the coming sprint, we think we can take on this much work. So they'll go to the backlog and they'll pull forward these amount of stories that they think they can complete in 2 weeks. They then go through and they go into what they call daily stand-ups. For the next 2 weeks, they'll go through every day in the morning or at some agreed upon time, and they'll answer a handful of questions. What did they do since yesterday? What do they want to do today? And what's in their way? So what they're doing is they're focusing themselves on, hey, we have some work in front of us for this next 2 weeks. Here's what we're doing. Here's our progress. And also here's our impediments. Here's the stuff that is blocking us from completion. And so whether it's a product owner or a scrum master, they can then take those impediments and do something about that so the team can remain productive. Well, at the end of the week, jump into number 3 now. So every day they're meeting and they're getting through and they're knocking off the items in their sprint backlog. Then at the end of the 2 weeks, that team will get in front of the customer or in front of the product owner, and they'll say, 2 weeks ago, this is what we committed to you, Mr. Product Owner, to produce. Well, here we are. Here's what we've produced. What do you think? And so it gives the product owner now an opportunity to sit down and say, yeah, that's good. Love it. Can you do this? Can you add to it? Or they'll go, whoa, not at all what I wanted. And in that worst case scenario, it means the team has wasted 2 weeks. But the product owner can now say, not what I wanted. Here's now what I do want based upon what I've seen. So they have an opportunity to now pivot. One of my favorite cliches or my favorite quotes is a lot of our customers in the digital space, a lot of our customers don't know what they want until they see what they don't want. And so going through these 2-week sprints, it gives the teams an opportunity to test all along the way. Is this good? Is this good? And then after that sprint review, usually right on the heels of it, they have something called the sprint retrospective. So they'll excuse the product owner, they'll excuse some of the customers, and the team now just sits down and they go, okay, over the last 2 weeks, what worked well? What do we want to accelerate or do again in the next sprint? And over the last 2 weeks, what didn't work well? What do we have to safeguard? Maybe our stories weren't well formed. Maybe we didn't collaborate as a team enough. Maybe we didn't do this. Maybe we didn't do that. So that sprint retrospective at the end of the 2 weeks gives the team an opportunity now to say, are we getting better? Or how can we get better? So it puts that focus on, let's keep improving on that continual cycle. And we do that every 2 weeks. So some of you, when you go through school, and when you think back to your school days, some of you wouldn't have done your essay or your assignment until the very last minute. You know, if it wasn't for the last minute, nothing would get done. Well, the purposes of having those sprints is that you have all those little time box events, like your stand-ups, like your reviews, like your retrospectives. By having an end date every 2 weeks, it gives a team motivation to make sure that they're producing something and that they can quickly pivot in the form of the planning and the retrospectives thereafter. So it's a really good motivator to understand, here's what we have to do to continue to keep advancing the cause. So it really drives that team home in terms of getting better. So hopefully that helped ground on what an agile process looks like. And this is Scrum. There's a whole bunch of different variants out there. There's variants out there like extreme programming. There's variants out there like Kanban. But they all have a lot of similarities in terms of trying to drive some of these concepts home. Why this all works is that when you start to put this all together, this is how you can take on the complicated and complex situations so well. So this diagram is taken right from the Agile Practice Guide, so I'm not going to take any credit for this one. But what you see is you have the Agile Values. So you have to have the right mindset to say, I'm going to go after feedback. And so from my experience, especially in the enterprises, a lot of times people say that they like feedback, but they actually don't like feedback. What they're doing is they're looking for validation. So let me give you an example. Is that when you type up a Word document and you say, I want to get some feedback on this Word document, and you send this Word document out to a handful of people. And when you get that Word document back, if there's a whole bunch of track changes on there and the document's all red because people have made some changes and modifications, are you actually happy about that or are you unhappy about that? So for the people that actually wanted validation, they want to see that Word document come back with almost no edits. What they want to see is that in that email with the attachment saying, hey, good job, so-and-so, looks great. They're looking for validation, not feedback. The Agile mindset says, I actually want to see all the track changes. I want to see how I can take that document, that working outcome, that output, and improve it. So that Agile value, the Agile mindset is supported by those 4 Agile values that I showcased earlier on. So in terms of valuing collaboration, in terms of looking at the working outcome as a means of progress, valuing individuals and interactions, those values are supported with that mindset. But what you also have is way on the opposite side there, is you have practices and roles and concepts that will reinforce the values and principles. And what's funny is that you actually need both sets of the spectrum to work. So there's a comment out there that says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's very true. If you want to change if you want to instantiate a strategy into the organization's culture will actually dictate whether you'll be successful or not. But in that same body of work, what they also will say is that structure dictates culture, or culture follows structure, which means that if you have a very waterfall-centric approach, a stage-gate approach where you take a step, do a design, do some requirements, do a design, do the build, do the test, it's difficult to go through a feedback cycle when you have to follow all those sequential steps all the way through. So point I'm trying to drive home with this slide here is that you need the practices and principles to support the values, and you need the values to be supported by the mindset. So it's a bi-directional support cause. You have to have one versus the other, or one and the other. So hopefully that made some sense there. So at this point, what I wanted to do was actually take some questions for you folks. So I want to share the screen with you. Hopefully you can see the screen as it comes up in real time there. What are some of the things that you want to see come forward? And then looking for either Joy or Kim, if you guys can help me with the questions that we might want to answer.
Joey, to kick it off here, I'm kind of curious. You had discussed a little bit, a fair bit about the importance of mindset and culture when implementing Agile practices. When organizations are looking at Agile and they're maybe looking at recruiting new talent, is there certain skill sets or personality traits that you would be really looking for to support that environment?
What a great question. And so when we're doing this a lot right now in my place of work, and so some of the stuff that we ground on. So when we look at some of the would-be project team participants, there's an old adage out there is that I think I can teach the hard skills relatively straightforward. So what that means is that I'm going to look for a mindset. I'm going to look for the person's personality and their adaptability and their comfort with ambiguity, their comfort with change, and I'll say an adaptive environment versus a person who's rigid. They have to I absolutely know exactly what I have to do tomorrow for me to be happy. Well, that's not going to be as workable in an agile environment as a person who's going to say, you know what, I'm comfortable with whatever change is coming down the path because I know that myself and the team can actually work through it. So it's getting into that mindset that a person's more comfortable with ambiguity and change and uncertainty than not. Now, having said that, if you're looking for a technology project, obviously you look for something that has some similarities in that tech space. I wouldn't be looking for a person in the medical profession if it has something not at all to do with that. But for me, I'd rather look at the soft skills first, that mindset, and then I look at the hard skills second.
We have a question here from Kate. She is wondering about how you get funding on the outset of a project that you don't have all the details on until it's already in progress.
Oh, that's a great question, Kate. A great question and a very common question. And so I look at it this way. And so some of the conversations I've had with my sponsors, typically when you look at waterfall, and so when people think of a waterfall-based delivery, you go through, you understand your problem, you do all your requirements, you do your requirements and your analysis, you do your design, you do your build, and so forth. And somewhere in that point, you have something that they call project sanction, usually right around the time of design. And so when you've done your design, you go back and say, we're ready now to get full funding for the project, and here's all the work that we've done. The point of that is that in the waterfall-based delivery, typically what they do is they eliminate risk by doing all this analysis and all this documentation. And in some cases, that works absolutely fine. The agile world, we address risk in a different fashion. We address risk through uncertainty, or through the process that I showed you a couple of slides ago, is that we're going to take on the riskiest and most value-creating portions first. And by doing so, we will then have a better understanding of the risk that remains in the project by going after the most difficult ones first. So what that means, a backward way of answering your question, is that what we typically look at as a resource-based funding model for your project. So when you create your backlog, and you often do that in the support of a story map or some other structure to say, here's the breadth and some degree of depth of our project, we'll create a backlog. And out of that backlog, we'll say, we think we know what skill sets are going to be required and what quantities of skill sets that we will require in the delivery team to complete this backlog. And so you might need a team of 6, 7, 8, 9 people. And with that team of, say, 6 people, sake of argument, you can generally say that we think it's going to be these 6 people for this period of time, a year. And so 2,000 hours per year, 6 people, we know what the cost is. We know what the project budget will be now for this costing. So, okay, hopefully this is starting to answer your question, is that the resource in Agile-based projects, we look at a resource-based model that says, here's the team, here's the size, notwithstanding software purchases and hardware purchases. But Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Gatekeeper, or Mr. Product Owner, we know that as we go through with those cycles of sprints and sprint reviews, as soon as we get better certainty, we can come back to you way earlier in the project lifecycle to say whether we think this is going to be good from a costing standpoint or whether not so good. So hopefully that answered your question. Our funding at the outset of the project is usually based upon a skill set or resource-based budgeting, using the backlog to inform you about what skills you need. So hopefully that helped.
We have another question that's come in. It's about Agile in program and project management with large versus small teams.
So what you're actually commenting on there's I'll say it's almost an Agile anti-pattern, and it happens a lot, is that you'll say, well, we want to be Agile and we want a team of 60 people. Well, it's tough to actually be Agile when you have 60 people. When you think of some of the hallmarks of team effectiveness and how do you get teams to really work effectively together. Scrum, by its definition, recommends a team no larger than 9. And so that when you get into that, and when you get into the data behind it, teams can actually be a lot more effective in terms of communicating and collaborating with one another. They have enough girth in terms of anywhere from 5 to 9 people where they can get enough work done, cross-functional and stuff, obviously notwithstanding. So then the challenge is that, at least in the enterprise, is that you'll have these big programs, like you can imagine, whether it's an ERP implementation or an accounting package implementation, and you have a team of 50, 60 people. What we would recommend is that you look at, I'll say, 1 or 2 approaches to take those big teams and break them down into small teams. The first approach would be to go by feature sets. So you might have a group that's working only on, say, the web side, and another team that's working only on the back office side or the database side. Is you're starting to carve out the teams based upon feature sets. And hopefully with that, there's enough work from the backlog where it can substantiate that feature set, and that you can get your featured teams to be in that 5 to 10 range. The other way, the second method for taking large teams and breaking them down into smaller teams, is by going through vertical slicing. And so you can start to say, I'm going to create a team that's now going to be responsible for producing this function that you're looking to release for the customer. And that might be a web-based middleware team and database person would all be in that same team. So really what you want to do is you want to understand within the program and project that you're taking on, what are the different features and functions that you have? Can you either vertically slice them or organize those groups into feature teams or vertically function teams? What's often misunderstood is that you can actually have, out of one backlog, you can have multiple teams working on that singular backlog. And so you can have a Scrum's approach. You can use, there's a scaled Agile framework out there that allows for multitudes of teams. So for myself personally, we have groups now of 6, 7, 8 teams of 7 people all working on the same project, but they're all driven down into small teams.
Thanks, Mustafa. Kim is asking, is cultural transformation a critical precursor for Agile to be successful?
It's a good question. It's a heavy question. I don't think it's a precursor as much as I think that it's a cyclical piece. I think that part of the cultural transformation, when you go through an Agile transformation, I think you have to go through a cultural mindset shift as well. And so one begets the other, and then you almost get into this iterative or incremental release. I don't think you can change the culture all in one swoop to become Agile, nor can you take the Agile world and change it all and then change the culture afterwards. I think the two have to go hand in hand and iterate and cycle through. So hopefully that helped. Hopefully that answered the question.
So did you want to kind of loop back on the Mentimeter here and see, looks like Agile and remote distributed teams is the number one that's come
Yeah,
through.
it's great. So what we'll do, and I'll work with the SAIT folks. So it looks like we have, well, it's a lot closer to almost one than the number we've expected, but looks like how do we do Agile with remote and distributed teams? Something that we're all getting experience now thanks to this crisis-based environment. Agile across industries is a close second, it looks like. And ironically, a lot of the Agile origins and a lot of the Agile theorists came from manufacturing. So Toyota Production Systems, a lot of the manufacturing world was the harbinger of Agile. Yet over the last 10, 15 years, the software community has been so strong in Agile so that most people think Agile only applies to software development. And so I think there's some good topics there about how we can introduce it to other industries. And then the third one there, it's almost a tie when I look at with the other two, is overcoming resistance to Agile. And I think that was Kate's question from earlier. There was, I'm used to getting funding based upon scopes of work and estimating those scopes of work. How do we do resource-based funding? So yeah, there's a lot of tricks and suggestions that we can have brought forward. None of it's easy, so don't think the tips and tricks are going to be a silver bullet for you, but at least we can have some ideas to throw out there.
Joey, this overview on Agile was really informative. We really appreciate it. To our listeners, we really appreciate you joining us today. As Joey had mentioned, he will be sending out the recording for this webinar as well as the slides. And you can contact us at corporate.training@sait.ca. Kim will put that in the chat for you as well. With any additional questions that you might have for Joey, we'll get that over to him and try to get those answered for you. And if you're looking for any information on the new programs that SAIT's developing for Agile practices, definitely send us an email and we're happy to fill you in on all that. But thanks so much, and I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Thanks, Joey.
Okay, thanks, guys.